Hey everyone, welcome to the Backstage Classical Career Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Katrina Stroud, and I'm a classical violinist who started playing at the age of 3. I graduated from the Robert McDuffie Center for Strings at Mercer University with my bachelor's in violin performance, and I'm pursuing my master's in music at the University of Michigan. In this series, I invite esteemed classical musicians onto the show and interview them to tell their stories and give advice to share with others and preserve their legacies. Today's episode is with Nancy Zhou, an incredible violinist who I've had the privilege to work with through the connection of one of my previous teachers, Pasha Zabori. Nancy is not only one of the greatest performers I've heard live, but also a very thoughtful and dedicated teacher. A few years ago at a festival, hosted by my previous teacher, Pasha, Nancy was my chamber coach for the Gran Turismo Violin Octet by Andrew Norman, which, for those of you who don't know, the piece is extremely complex and difficult. The festival was only 10 days long, and one night, Nancy came to the dorms where we were staying at and gave us a coaching in the movie room until almost 1 a.m. in order to help us figure out how to put the piece together. Of course, it was optional for us to stay or participate the whole time, but I hope this shows everyone just how committed she is to her craft. For those of you who don't know, Nancy Zhou is a renowned violinist whose thoughtful musicianship and robust online presence resonate with a global audience that brings her on stage with leading orchestras around the world. Nancy is a passionate soloist who cherishes chamber music collaborations and commits to the responsibility of education. Nancy is a regular guest educator at various international summer festivals, holding not only masterclasses, but also workshops on fundamental training and well-being for musicians. Her interest in cultural heritage and the humanities manifested in a string of notable collaborations across the U.S. and in China. She presented Zhao Juping's first violin concerto, gave the U.S. premiere of Unsuk Chin's Grand Cadenza for 2 solo violins with Anne-Sophie Mutter, and gave the West Coast premiere of Vivian Feng's Violin Concerto No. 1. Born in Texas to Chinese immigrant parents, Nancy began the violin under the guidance of her father, who hails from a family of traditional musicians. She went on to study with Miriam Fried at the New England Conservatory while pursuing her interest in literature at Harvard University. Since 2019, she is an associated artist of the Queen Elizabeth Chapel and was appointed professor of violin at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music in September 2023. She will also be a resident faculty member at the Tianjin Juilliard School starting in fall 2026. Thank you so much for joining my podcast today. So you were raised in an immigrant family, and your father comes from a line of traditional musicians. What was that
Mhm.
experience like for you?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I obviously my dad was my teacher throughout my youth, and from quite a young age, he would play. This is tangentially related to my family coming from a traditional musical background, but he would play records by this Mando pop star Teresa Tang, who sought inspiration from the music idiom, and she was definitely a cultural, as much a cultural icon as she was a social advocate for bridging Taiwan and Chinese politics. So that was kind of the musical soundtrack throughout my childhood, and then every time I'd go back to China, which would be about once or twice a year, I would hear my uncle, my dad's eldest brother, play the erhu, which is a two-stringed, basically a Chinese violin instrument, see him perform, and my youngest uncle is actually a calligrapher, so he is very well-versed in Chinese poetry. So it's just really nice to see kind of the intersection of different art disciplines come together. My grandpa played the guqin, which is a zither instrument. But that being said, I do have to say that I didn't really have many chances to see them perform together, but rather quite separately. It was kind of a silent force that ran throughout my childhood, which was nice.
Wow, that's super cool. Yeah. And then you went on to go get your education at the New England
Mhm.
Conservatory and Harvard School. How have they both affected your career?
So it was not easy to be part of a double degree program, but they really spoke to my love for books. I pursued an English degree and literature degree at Harvard, doing English literature and Russian literature at the same time. NEC it speaks for itself. I always knew that I wanted to pursue a career in music, but I also didn't want to, I guess, keep my love for reading and writing, and all of that silent. So it was just for me the perfect decision. And if I was accepted, then that's ideal. So, and I was. So it was really interesting to spend all these years throughout my college career asking the question of how these different disciplines intersect. And that has really informed my music making throughout the last 4 or 5 years. Yeah.
Yeah, wow. Who have been some of the most influential people in your career?
I will start saying that, of course, my father. I think I would be a bad child if I didn't say my father, although he was, quite a strict disciplinarian throughout my childhood. He was the one who really first introduced me to the idea of mind over matter, teaching me how to practice as efficiently as possible within his own capabilities. Miriam Fried, of course, is also an inspirational figure. She really was my guiding light throughout my college career, understanding how to read a score, because that was something that I was not very acquainted with prior to going to college, if I am being very honest. So seeing the music making experience as one that is really at the essence about chamber music. Even if you are playing a concerto with an orchestra, you're still highly sensitive of, how everything fits together for something that is larger than yourself. So
Mm.
yeah, Miriam for sure, Augustin Dumay as well. I'm basically listing all my musical mentors at this point. I met him at a competition in China, I think around 7 years ago in 2018. And he invited me to come to the Queen Elizabeth Music Chapelle to study with him. And this was right before I did the Isaac Stern competition. So that was also very inspiring to see how because he has quite an active performing career, just to get his perspective on the art of performing, the art of interpretation. And it was hugely different from Miriam in that way. But this is how you learn best, basically being exposed to such drastically different thoughts and approaches to music. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say Anne Sophie Mutter as well, because she has been such a huge supporter for my career in the financial way, in an artistic way, being able to perform with her on stage and seeing how she works, not only on stage but also backstage. Yeah, so these are some of the figures, and then I have many figures who are dead, and what I mean by that is that, you have these literary figures like Dostoevsky. I read a lot of his novels. So he's been such an inspirational force as well.
Wow, a
Yeah.
lot of incredible people for sure. So, speaking of competitions, you have done a lot of competitions
Mhm.
and been very successful. What was that part of your career phase like?
There's this important question that one starts asking, probably during college or even high school, where you wonder how important competitions are, right? Is it important to get that visibility? Is it important for the experience? And it's a little bit controversial. I think less so nowadays, because you see more and more people expressing that interest, and there's so many competitions out there now in the industry. But it's kind of a hard question to answer, because on the one hand, it was Bartok who said that competitions are for horses, which is true. It has basically nothing to do with music when you think about the idea of competing. But I also think that it's the angle at which you look at these things. If it's just merely a learning experience, and if you're able to tell yourself to be a healthy loser, know how to fail, because that is an essential step to growing, then it can be a huge asset for your growth, because you get to expand your repertoire. There is that pressure of trying to deliver your best on stage. There is the beautiful byproduct of meeting your colleagues, similar age group for the most part, and being inspired by others who have the same kind of motivation, hopefully, for the good of the just excelling. And because I mean, of course, the level of playing nowadays is so high, at least technically speaking, right? So I think it's a little bit of a kind of weighing pros and cons, seeing what works best for you. But in general, I think it has helped me quite a lot, just in terms of boosting my resilience, learning how to lose gracefully, and learning from those so-called failures and growing from that, and going into the next competition with a slightly more open mindset, and learning how to practice as efficiently because time is not really on our side in some ways. And then having to learn all this repertoire, competitions are becoming much more demanding, and that's just because the pool that they have to draw from, like the supply is just so much more. There's so many violinists out there. So I think there can be a lot of pressure, but in some ways I think it's your frame of mind that really makes a difference. Yeah. So it has helped me a lot getting to know certain important contacts in the industry. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective on competitions for sure that
Mm,
I haven't thought about. You were speaking of Anne-Sophie Mutter.
mm.
Can you talk about your time with her and your time touring with her and stories from that time?
Yeah. So I met Miss Mutter back in 2008. It's been so many years already. So I decided to apply for her foundation back then because I mean, of course, she was a recurring role model throughout my childhood, and I have quite a lot of CDs from her discography. So I grew up listening to that alongside many other recordings from other violinists. So I decided to apply for a foundation. I auditioned for her in Kansas City when she was doing a recital. So my father and I drove from San Antonio, Texas to Kansas City, listened to the recital, and then she had me audition for her after what was a very extensive preliminary period of sending her recordings. She would ask for make these really unique requests of, oh, can you send me a recording of Beethoven Kreutzer Sonata? And I mean, at that point, I was 13, and I was just like, oh, this is super demanding, right? Or Brahms Sonata, or any of these really great composers that are part of the standard repertoire. So I sent in a lot, and I actually she was very curious about my interest in cello. I played the cello at one point, very amateurly so, but I could play the Haydn concerto, for example, at that point. So she was very interested in that. She asked me to send in piano recordings as well. So that was part of an extended preliminary period of auditioning, and then I finally got to meet her in person in Kansas, and she set up a pianist with me, and we did I think we did a few Beethoven and Brahms sonatas as well. And then she said, right then, I think her first piece of advice was go get a boyfriend, which was kind of crazy coming from her, but it also speaks to her sense of humor, and she's very down to earth, but very sharp-minded in terms of what she wants with helping young musicians, and she has a very clear vision for that. So it's been very inspirational. So I entered the foundation as a recipient and a beneficiary, and throughout the next few years or so, got to tour with her um, in different settings, playing chamber music repertoire, of course. And then even at one point towards the end of my time with the foundation, playing a duet with her, a duo. We did the New York premiere of Eun-Suk Chin's Grand Duo, Grand Cadenza, for two violins. So that was definitely a highlight in my artistic career. And it's been, yeah, very fascinating to see someone in the ranks, especially a woman, who lived through, probably many decades of just again, there's a lot of not baggage, shall we say, but just, a lot of hurdles that you have to go through, navigate through as a woman. But I think she's a brilliant example of someone who has succeeded, and we also know that it's not just about the music making, but it's about also how you frame your story and how you make it relevant to the changing times in society, and that I find hugely inspirational.
For sure, that's very inspiring, and you're both incredible violinists, so that's amazing
Thank
that
you.
that collaboration happened. So, can you talk a little bit about your recent research trip with
Mm,
Vivian Fong and the new album that you recently just released, which is out now and everybody should go listen to?
thank you. Yeah, those two projects are definitely milestones in the most recent phase of my career. This commission project with Vivian is very, very unique and special for me in the sense that through this project, I not only get to meet an amazing composer, her music really resonates with me 'cause she has this, her ethos is really all about giving voice, not in a culturally appropriating way, but giving voice to a pocket of community that we don't really ever get exposed to, especially city dwellers, right? So going into these folk villages, for example, in Yunnan, China, and in my case, my mom is a folk minority dancer of Boye descent, and she comes from the southwestern part of China. It's a province called Guizhou. Getting to retrace the steps of my family history, discovering that actually so many of my relatives who are directly or indirectly related to my mom's side of the family are so musically gifted, and it's a musical language that I've never been exposed to as a Western classically trained musician, as a Chinese American. But on the one hand, it's like all of these summer trips that I did in my childhood, once or twice a year. And then the influences that I had from my dad, coming from a family of traditional musicians, and hearing the recordings of Teresa Tang and all of these great mandopop icons. It just all kind of came together during this one trip in June. And so I was highly emotional, and Vivian was the best partner that I could ask for to accompany me throughout this journey, because she herself is also coming from a family of Cambodian immigrants who fled from the Khmer Rouge regime, and they then situated themselves in Canada, and then now she's living in the East Bay. So it's just kind of nice to see how such different backgrounds can have these links, right? And so
Mhm.
we're especially excited. We got to witness, I guess you can call her my mom's twice removed cousin, I guess. She's so talented. She's such a force in her small community and in the village. Um, it's basically a peasant village, and people there, for the most part, especially the elderly generations, are still wearing traditional Boye outfits, and seeing them go about their daily lives, washing clothes, in their local streams, and having dinner and meals together outside of it's not even you can't even really call it a patio. It's really a traditional Boye house and construct where you get to oversee all of these beautiful, gorgeous rolling hills. It's just, yeah, it's pretty stunning, I think, in all senses. And she was able to make music with the leaf, for example, and sing folk tunes that have to do with, marriage ceremonies, but not only that, courtship, and talking about wine toasting and welcoming guests. So there's a plethora of like so many different traditional practices. So I, for one, felt it was a very strange feeling. I felt like, I was an outsider observing, being very careful not to appropriate and claim that I know anything about, this part of my family history, but also very beautiful in the sense that I got to discover these amazing traits from family members that I don't really ever talk to, because just simply because I live on the other side of the world and don't have much time, right? So through this research, yeah, I got to spend about 5 or 6 days just trying to understand the surface of such a rich tradition. So that was amazing. And then you were asking about, oh, my album, right? So yeah, so the album is in some ways, if not completely related, at least tangentially. It's just because one of the staples in that album is the Bella Bartok Solo Sonata. And that's a sonata that I think has acquired a bit of a tricky reputation. Many violinists don't really like it because it's so hard, especially the fugue movement. But this is actually a piece that it really spoke to me already since maybe 10 or 12 years. I first studied it for a competition in Finland, Sibelius competition. This was back in, I believe, 2010 or maybe 2015 was when it was required for the preliminary round, one of the movements. But prior to that, I already heard about the sonata. There's, of course, the legendary Menuhin recording of it, and it was just at that point when I was first hearing it, I was like, "Wow, this is completely foreign. It doesn't sound anything like Handel or Mozart or any of these guys that we're so familiar listening to." It's melodic, but it's also very angular, and it's highly complex, and it can sound very discordant and dissonant. But that's something that really spoke to me somehow. I just really like anything that kind of makes me stop and then wonder what the hell is this? So it
Yeah.
was, yeah, it was very interesting in that regard. But I never really plucked up the courage to study it, because I thought, "Oh, it's just so hard. I don't think I will be able to do it justice." But then I was thinking, because there was this idea of recording the first album, and I was like, "What do I want on there? Like, what is my mission? What is the story that I'm trying to tell?" Because I don't want this to just be another album thrown into the mix of albums just for the sake of recording. So, and I felt like, okay, I do have to record Bartok. I know that's a challenge that I'm able to take, and if it's a recording, that's twice the amount of pressure than performing would be. So I was like, this is, I work well under pressure, so let's just give it a shot, right? So that's kind of how it all started. That was the impetus. And because Bartok was such a huge advocate for really authentic folk music, not the folk music that we're talking about with Brahms, like Hungarian dances, which is more so like gypsy cafe music. Bartok was really the first one who went into the sticks, across Transylvania at that point, and even Egypt at some point, to collect Arabic, for example, folk music. And in his own native area, he went into peasant villages, really suffered quite a lot, because you basically go through mud pathways to get to these
Mm.
villages, and then there's the risk of being ostracized and judged, because there's a certain level of respect that you need to gain from these folk minority groups before you can even start recording their musical language. So he went through quite a lot of that, but he recorded so much with his what do you call it? Wax cylinders, right? There's some wax cylinder recordings on YouTube that you can hear, and it was deeply forensic. The process that he went through and dedicated, it was time consuming, and it's really special that the solo violin sonata was one of the last two works that he wrote at the end of his life. The other one being the concerto for orchestra, which is one of my absolutely favorite works as well. And to be able to see how he so artfully combined Western art music techniques, compositional techniques with the Eastern European folk idiom, right? So that to me is such a symbol of multiculturalism, done in such a respectful manner. If you read his writings on how he dealt with all of this and what his thoughts were, you can tell that he was just clearly very intelligent, but also having the highest of sensibilities. So I thought, this connects very well with me and Vivian going into into my mom's hometown village, and trying to document all of these things. So it came together quite nicely, I think, the timing of it all. And
Yeah.
the other pieces, on the album have their separate stories to tell. Izai and Chrysler were really close friends. They both are icons in the violin world. We look up to them, aspire to find that kind of special stamp with our musical voice, because you can clearly distinguish Izai sound versus Chrysler sound, and they come from the golden age of violin playing. So it's like these voices also really informed me throughout my childhood, and the Bach first partita has been absolutely one of my favorites. So it's like everything coming together. They all have their separate threads, but coming together to kind of respond to the question of what it means to be human.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I learned so much about cultural identity, and learning about different cultures in a very
Mhm.
respectful way,
Mm.
I think is very important and kind of the beauty of classical music, I feel
Yeah,
like.
yeah, for sure.
You were talking about this trip you did and these projects you do around your cultural heritage. How has kind of exploring your cultural heritage through classical music empowered you and your career?
It's a very good question, and I think that's a question that we should all be asking ourselves and asking each other, especially nowadays with what is particularly, I think, a trying time. I don't profess to really know much about global politics. I do keep up with the news, but there are certain incidents at this current time that that can be very distressing. In the Middle East, and I was just in Indonesia. There was a series of protests during that concert week. So there are plenty of events in the world that can be cause of distress, and we it's no better time to really kind of look towards each other and ask ourselves what it means to be a community, especially in modern society with, forces of capitalism and attention being a commodity, social media. There's just a lot that is fighting our attention, and we don't really have much time to sit down and think about what I think are important questions, right? To live a fulfilling life and to live a life of love and share that amongst each others. Yeah, being a musician requires your attention to also kind of ask yourself like what it means to be a citizen. So thinking about cultural heritage has been something that is hugely important for me since the last few years because I had a pretty sheltered childhood, but I was very, very grateful and privileged to have a good education during my high school career. I went to a private school during the last 2 years, and that was really where I started asking these important questions. Because, I mean, when you go to English class, right, and literature class, s- these questions come up when you read novels, the classic novels of literature, and I was just thinking to myself, well, it doing anything needs to mean something in the grander scheme, and it needs to serve others in a way. And I think try not to get yourself too obsessed with just what is immediately in front of you, because I think in some ways this industry can unintentionally do that. It can really pigeonhole you because you're striving for success. You're striving for success in a very competitive environment. And then throughout the journey of that, you may get what you want, but you might also get that at the expense of your sanity, right? And kind of get lost as to, oh, what did I do this for? And that happens quite commonly. Even when I started teaching at the San Francisco Conservatory, I noticed that students, of course, have this unquenchable thirst and curiosity, but they are also very worried about not having a job when they come out of school, or not really knowing what they want, and not also being fully aware that it takes so much work, not only physically but mentally to feel fulfilled, right? So I think it's really important to balance that out with asking these larger questions because then you start realizing that there are no concrete answers, and it's just really about the journey. And during that journey, you might as well take care of your body, you know. So
Mhm.
it's not only about cultural heritage, but also just physical well-being, because it all comes together at some point in your life when you start realizing that, wow, this is, the intersection of all of these things are really important. And that makes music making so much more meaningful to read literature, to be politically or socially active, and to travel, because traveling is the only way where you get to spend money to be rich, right? So, I mean, it's your way of spending a lot of money, but you get to observe different cultures, and it's just if that is within your bandwidth, try doing that much more and being more mindful, I think does help. That ties in with physical well-being, like being very present and observing and thinking a little bit more slowly, because that's something that we're pressured to do otherwise. Like we're pressured to just always be on top of it and think very quickly and do what's immediately best for us, right then and there, instead of like thinking about what your longer term vision is. Because I think it's going to be so much more hard nowadays with just politically what's going on and people in power and all of that. So I think anyway, all of this to say is that it does help with music making. It really opens the door to, the more experience you have, the more you can be sensitive to sound colors and to express different kinds of emotions and all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's very inspiring. Yeah, I love everything you just said. And speaking of physical well-being, how do you incorporate mindfulness and wellness into your own playing and also your teaching?
Yeah. So it all started with kind of getting into the writings of Dunas, who's a Greek pedagogue. He served, I think, in the First World War. He was a mandolin player. He was also a neuroscientist. So he was clearly, very intelligent.
Mhm.
So he talked a lot about this idea of expressive technique, which basically means, it's a type of technique where you're completely mindful of what you're intending to do and being able to know how to fully realize your musical intentions, right? So being very clear in terms of just like the biomechanics and the physical component of everything, knowing the how to the what. So I think that really inspired me because I had a period of time during college years where I struggled a little bit with tension, and I'm usually quite careful about this because my father talked a lot about trying to do the least amount of work, but produce like the best results, right? So being as efficient as possible. So I think that carried through with me. So I'm very grateful to that mantra, actually, where I started taking a step back and asking, why am I struggling with tension? What's going on with my practice habits? Is it a mismanagement of, energy and all of that? And that happened to be the time when I read more about Dunas and his writings, and that's what he was really all about from a violin standpoint. And I think it was also during that time where I developed an interest in yoga and Pilates. So because I noticed simply that after doing a session of yoga, I just felt much happier and more flexible and more alive. I could feel the current of energy going through my body. And to me, it was just like no question that I have to be mindful about these things when I practice, right? Because again, this speaks to the issue of stress, right? So learning how to manage your stress through workout, exercise, but also being very careful not to injure yourself with too much heavy weightlifting, because it can go the other way around where you get obsessed with something, especially during like the entry level phase when you're starting something new, depending on your personality. For me, I got super obsessed, but I was very careful about just making sure that I don't injure myself so I can keep playing, right? So yeah, and then I started learning more about Jennifer Johnson's book about body mapping, which has been hugely inspirational for me. Understanding what part of the body, as in anatomically, contributes to violin playing, what are really the most important muscles that you have to use, and how do you use those muscles not at the expense of your whole body tensing up. So I think that, and then also starting to teach and then listen to the stories of other young musicians complaining that they have tension problems, and I was like, "Yeah, we're not alone, right? We're all on the same boat, problem boats. Let's try to figure this out." So it not only helped me, but it equipped me to help others understand, and it's been quite beautiful to see how, some individuals have been directly impacted and now they're playing this much more free, right? So I think this also speaks to kind of this long-term vision, maybe short term. It's a very hard transition to go through, especially if you struggle with tension. There's certain habits that are just so hard to break out of, but it's well worth the time that you invest in. And it can be difficult when you're in school and you have so many auditions to prepare for. You have orchestra that consumes like 5 hours of your time, on one day. So it can be really, really tricky. And that's where exercise, physical well being, eating well can make a huge difference. And then your state of mind. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. All of us musicians deal with tension. Sometimes it's
Yeah.
hard to, keep up with our health because we're so busy, but it's
Hmm.
very important and always worth it for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you have quite a large following on social media. Can you talk a little bit about how you gained your following and what place social media has in the classical music world?
Yeah. Very, very important question, but very tricky to answer. There's no one simple answer. I think of it coming from different angles. But I can tell you how, it started out. So it was just kind of I think I started my Instagram profile when I was in college, maybe third year or so, third, fourth year. So it's quite a number of years by now. But back then, Instagram was a totally different animal from what it is now. Now that it's been acquired by Meta and all of these like platforms are kind of just learning from each other to see how best to grab the attention of the consumers because what they're interested in is having as many people build up profiles, right? So I think back then it was just simply, okay, I'll do it. I'll document my life, right? So I wasn't even going down that route of posting so many practice videos. I was just simply in it for the fun and games of it. For me, it was kind of a little game. It was like, oh, okay, so this is what attracts attention. But mind you, just consider this was like more than 10 years ago. People had slightly bigger attention span, right? So it was just, they would actually sit down and look at the video. And I got to also exercise my I guess what I learned from writing and my love for writing, kind of write compelling captions, right? So it was for me more of a practice and also just entertainment, keeping up with the lives of my friends who I wouldn't be able to see in person and all of that. So it was pretty humble at that point. And then I think it was at some point years down the road when you start feeling out the rhythm and you feel the sense of community because I think honestly back then I wasn't super self-aware. I didn't really know who I was, let alone trying to create some kind of identity on the digital world. It was just yeah, so it's just basically kind of lost. And then there were certain videos that would get many views. And I ask myself, why is that? Right. And of course, it's human of us to say, okay, I want to do more videos like that, right? So that you get that sense of popularity is something that we wouldn't deny ourselves. So, if I'm being very honest, it was really for attention at some point. And then I got tired of that because I was like, this is just stupid. I don't want to just keep doing this as way to get attention. And when you're in college, it's a particularly vulnerable period of time. Personally, I was very vulnerable. My parents were divorcing at that time. So it's just kind of like it was a particularly weak period of time psychologically. So, I think it was maybe mainly during COVID that I started feeling like, okay, this is actually a good tool to keep a sense of community. Because everyone was resorting to the digital world. That was the next best thing because we were all locked down, and I felt kind of I was thinking, well, how can I create content that speaks to others and still capitalize on my strengths, right? So, and I knew that I had this passion for analyzing the physicality of playing. I'm hyper analytical, so I felt like, maybe this is the time where I get to express really truly what brings me joy, and hopefully that speaks to others. And that was also at the time when Hillary Hahn started her hashtag of 100 days of practice. So it gave me courage to kind of do something not similar entirely, but something that was inspired by that, but kind of hold it in my own, um, create it in my own language, what I'm most comfortable with. So that was the next phase, and now I'm in this current phase where I start thinking, okay, so it's been very, very gratifying and meaningful to see all the resonance and have people ask me questions, not only see me as this performer, but perhaps a voice behind stage and feel accessible to them. And so I've gotten a lot of joy, just even meeting people that I would never meet when I travel for concerts and come up to me and say, I've seen your content on Instagram and it's helped me a lot. And that's really something that I think is hugely rewarding. Even at this point in Portugal, when I was there just a few weeks ago in Braga, I had no idea that Braga is a place for refugees from Afghanistan, right? So the Afghanistan Music Institute, of course, during the Taliban regime, many people had to flee, and Braga was a sanctuary city. So it was really meaningful for me to meet a girl who came from, and a few other students as well from that institute, um, and come to the concert and say, "I've been following you for years. Your music making, but beyond that, it's just music at large has been such a um, powerful connecting force, right? So it's a sense of community, and that's where I start thinking about politics, right? So like how can I use this to be a humanitarian? I'm still grappling with that. There are certain things where I feel like, you know, if I say this, would it jeopardize my career? These stupid questions that go through your mind. But I think it's at this point where I feel like I need to enter the next phase and really just be honest because I've been trying to contain my political leanings in certain point because is it just a tool of art? Is art just art or is art political inherently? And so these are important questions that I think everyone should be asking if we are to aspire to bring peace, and we are arbiters of peace as musicians at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's an amazing journey through your social media career, and I definitely draw a lot of inspiration from your posts as well and learn a lot from them, and I think you're doing a really great job.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
You've premiered a lot of violin concerti. How do these collaborations come about, and do you have any stories to share?
Yeah. So actually hasn't been quite many, but hopefully, more and more. But so for example, I gave the Western premiere of again my friend from the East Bay, Vivian Fung's first violin concerto, but she actually wrote it for a colleague of mine, Kristen Lee. So Kristen had the pleasure of giving the actual world premiere, but so it's really nice to see how you know, just the language and the works of contemporary composers come to life, and that's something that has been incredibly meaningful for me because you get to work with a living composer, you get to engage in a dialogue and see how they respond to your initial interpretations. And you start realizing that it's not such a prescriptive formula. It's not very restricting as we think it would be when we look at a work by Beethoven or Brahms, like any of these really venerated composers that carry such huge weight. Because there's a certain tradition to play them, or Mozart, for example. But you start reading the letters of Mozart, and then you come to understand that he was just such a funny person, right? And he had the most fun in his life. He was, yeah, maybe dirt poor, but he was as human as it could be. He had his moments of jealousy, he had his moments of pressure with his father. His whole riff with Salieri, and also it's just there's more to it than just austerity and seriousness, I think, to classical music, and that's something that we need to realize, but not at the expense of being theatrical and abusing, and being tasteless or any of that, and imposing your own voice on something just for the sake of being interesting or something like that. So I think it's a delicate balance, but these are questions that we constantly have to ask. I was very honored to give the as I told you, New York, Chicago, and Toronto premieres of Unsuk Chin's Grand Cadenza. That was a very fascinating journey with Anne-Sophie Mutter because I got to see how my understanding and our collective understanding with Miss Mutter's how it evolves throughout time when you perform it more than once. Eunsook Chin herself, I think, unfortunately, wasn't there for any of the 3 concerts that I played with Mutter, but I think it's just kind of giving yourself that comfort knowing that, the composer is alive and there's always room for creative possibilities that may or may not deviate too much with the score, right? Is really liberating in some ways, and I learned a lot from that experience, and you start approaching works by dead composers, kind of similarly, um, but and learning how to score read and be as meticulous, but at the end, trying to be spontaneous and just the more data you have in the back of your mind, the more freeing it gets, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's very thought provoking. Finding that balance, like you were saying about the composer and your own personal voice. Very interesting things
Hmm.
to think about.
Hmm.
Who do you turn to for advice today?
Very good question. Of course, I still ask Miss Butcher for advice. I ask my husband for advice, Adam, loved ones. I do have a very close relationship with Shanghai Quartet's first violinist, Wei Lee. He used to teach in Montclair. University, but they're now at the Tianjin Juilliard School. He's been a family friend of mine. He was a upper classmate of my dad at the Shanghai Conservatory, and I've been always in touch with him regularly. And especially nowadays, I think he's such a voice of reason. He's so gentle, so it's really nice to see that kind of vibe and charisma work its magic during a time where everything's so fast paced. So yeah, I turn to these people for advice, and of course, my manager as well. Yeah,
Yes. And I always close out with this one question. What advice would you give to aspiring professional musicians?
I would say be honest with yourself. Honesty is it's a hard one. It can be it's so hard that it can be kind of a rarity nowadays. You know, what does it really mean to be honest with yourself? Ask yourself, what is it that you want? We can get very easily lost with just the barrage of we're in an information era, right? So social media, the news, socializing. There's a lot that is really competing for our attention. Ask what it is that you want. And I'm talking about beyond material wealth, which is important to survive, in a capitalist society, especially in the States. But try to balance that out with understanding that it's okay to embrace your selfish interests, right? Self serving interests, as in feeling good about, you know, music making and all of that, but also understanding that it takes a lot of discipline and to make that realization, you really have to be honest. So discipline is really key. There's no shortcut with art, especially with violin playing or any, mastery of an instrument. And then beyond that, figuring out why are you playing the violin in this day and age, right? It's not just about being perfect and artistically capable, but also learning how to communicate and socialize with people and telling a story that is uniquely yours, but also resonates with a broader community is very important if you want to make a name for yourself. So I think it's a really mixed bag of understanding that's important to be disciplined, to work, thoughtfully, to put in the hours and to be tenacious, don't give up, and try to remain inspired by looking outwards other than your own close community and conservatory scope, right? So live life if you can. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great advice. And thank you for such an inspiring and thought provoking interview today.
Sure. It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Katrina.
Thank you so much to Nancy Zhou for another great episode. Her dedication to the craft of violin playing is evident, and as a Chinese American myself, I was very inspired by her research project with Vivian Vong and her efforts to incorporate her cultural identity in her musical career. To learn more about Nancy and to listen to her new album, Stories Retraced, visit nancyzhouviolin.com. Thank you so much for joining me on Backstage Classical Career Conversations, and be sure to subscribe to the show and rate us on the platform you're using. To donate to the show to help us keep creating content, click on the support link in the description. I'm Katrina Stroud, and it was great to see you here. Until next time, stay inspired and listen to the stories of others.